Well, I appreciate the introduction, and I am, honored to be part of the conference. It seems like a terrific agenda, and things that we have been talking about at my organization for a number of years, but have taken on added significance since the pandemic took over the world in the last couple of years. So let me just say a little bit about who I am, where I'm coming from. I am the CEO of an organization in the States called the National Conference of State Legislatures. So we are really the professional association for lawmakers and their staffs in the 50 states, as well as the territories of the United States and the District of Columbia, which is sort of an odd subnational entity here that's not quite a state, not a territory, but a district. So we have in that collection of states and territories, there are roughly 7,600 lawmakers, legislators, and about 25 to 30,000 legislative staff. And so we are their professional association. We bring them together constantly, both now in virtual formats as well as in-person meetings. We have a large summit every year where it's sort of our big legislative convention. We call it our legislative summit that draws about 6,000 people interested in legislatures, what they do, the policies they're looking at, as well as the operations and the institution itself. So we were founded in 1975. Of course, legislatures on the North American continent have existed for just over 400 years. The first thing we recognize as a legislature was in what was then the colony of Virginia in the late 1600s. So it's a terrific job that I have. I love it. I have been working in and with legislatures for over 30 years. So I've seen a lot of change, but also I can tell you that change is a slow process certainly in the American state legislatures. We sometimes joke that I think Iceland in Thingvellir claimed the first legislative assembly where a group of community leaders or clan chieftains of some kind came together in the 800s in the 9th century as the first legislative assembly. That would be we sometimes joke that legislatures are 9th century institutions racing into the 10th century because they're just slow to change and embrace technology. That is just a joke, because what we have seen in the last 2 years has been a swift embrace of some technology to manage the legislative process and to keep legislatures working and focused on the things they needed to be focused on, representing the people, passing good policy. We've seen that happen very swiftly because of the pandemic, and a lot of innovation and a lot of quick pivoting and just constant innovation. And a lot of that has been technology driven, but also some other ways that they've done it in terms of how people work and how they relate to each other. But I would say in the United States, among the state legislatures, which as maybe many of the folks on the call know, have a great deal of authority, in many ways are far more active in American policymaking than the national legislature, which because of the political situation is actually not all that active and is not as aggressive in addressing the issues that Americans want their elected leaders to deal with. So the legislatures in the states are somewhat evolved at this point, of course, with a lot of work left to go. And really that modernization started to take place in the 1970s. So they've been on a trajectory ever since. When I started, I was thinking about this conference and this discussion. When I started working in legislatures, hardly any states had any kind of electronic bill drafting process. They were just starting in, and they had these really cumbersome systems that had special codes and that were based on big mainframe computers that existed and had rooms of their own. And of course, now every legislature has a very sophisticated drafting system and paper management system. And a handful of American state legislatures have gone completely paperless, not completely, but have moved to a paperless system and that kind of thing. So I guess I've seen a great deal of change in the 30 years that I've been working. I started out working in one of our state legislatures in North Carolina. And of course, I've now worked, done special projects and been to all but I think 3 or 4 of the U.S. State capitals. So it's a great career, and I'm a big believer in the legislative institution and the role that it has to, be the voice of the people and represent the people, and especially at a time when here in the United States, there's a great deal of friction right now between the executive branch and the legislative branch. I think it's just amplified. There's always a great deal of friction between those two branches because of our presidential system. But during the pandemic, there's been a lot of conflict as the executives have had to move swiftly and do things somewhat unilaterally. And then legislators have been pushing back pretty hard to reestablish the authority of the legislature to look at the big policy goals, not just in the state of emergency that states have found themselves in. I again, at NCSL, our organization, we're based in Denver, Colorado, not in Washington. We do have a Washington, D.C. office, which is, as you all know, is the U.S. capital, but we're in Denver, one of the 50 state capitals, the capital of the state of Colorado. And we have about 170 staff that support all of the work of the 50 state legislatures as well as the territories. We do a great deal of policy research around everything that states are looking at, from electrification of the auto industry and sort of the public role in that. This is one example. Infrastructure generally, power grids and roads and bridges and those kinds of things. Of course, legislators are very active in healthcare, budget and tax policy. We have fiscal experts that help state legislators and legislative staff understand broad policy trends as well as what's happening in other states. So we have, and marijuana policy. The United States has quite a patchwork of laws around the legalization of marijuana, which has been happening fairly steadily over the past 10 years in the United States. So just an example, we have kind of almost like a think tank of researchers who study these issues and produce materials and conferences for legislators and legislative staff to learn from each other. And then we do a lot of association kinds of things. We hold conferences. We produce a magazine. We have a very robust website with an immense amount of information on it. So we bring them together to share ideas. And then finally, we actually are an advocacy association to the federal government. So we are constantly working with the U.S. Congress and the administration to make sure that when they do pass laws at the federal level, they don't preempt the authority of the states. Of course, our Constitution has a heavy federalism, state emphasis, and so we're always trying to influence that process. More than half of members of the U.S. Congress, or roughly half, were former state legislators, so they tend to understand that the primacy of the states in the U.S. constitutional structure. So that's what our organization is all about. Let me just say, I was asked to talk a little bit about sort of the modernization, particularly on the technology side. So I'm going to, speak at a really high level, and I won't go on for much longer about some of the big trends we've seen, inside the states recently. We did a survey in last year. Of course, the biggest thing that happened, and happened very quickly, was remote voting for the members. We had, a very strong tradition of, particularly in floor sessions, maybe not in committee session, but legislators had to be physically present for floor sessions in all 50 states, as well as the territories. But that changed in the pandemic. And what we found is that over 60% of the states said they were using some sort of remote voting applications for their House and Senate floor procedures. All of our legislatures are bicameral with a House and Senate, with the exception of one. One state just has a Senate and is unicameral. And that actually is significantly higher for committees. Now, there were a handful of states that already had remote participation by members prior to the pandemic, and those were the big rural western states in Wyoming and Alaska, and some of those that have extensive territory. They had some mechanism for some members to participate remotely from different parts of the states in committee hearings, not in floor sessions. But due to the pandemic, there was really a big divide among the U.S. states. There were some states that did every kind of physical accommodation you could for the pandemic, plastics and space, and they had members seated in the gallery so they could be a distance from each other to prevent the spread of COVID. but about more than half the states actually instituted remote voting sessions, and many of them use the Zoom platform. They just sort of adopted that for their purposes. And then, of course, with that was, how do you get the public to participate? And so again, remote public testimony in committees was not uncommon in the states. A number of states had it, but it was certainly the minority of states that did that, and that's now become far more commonplace. So you can sign up through the committee staff, and then most committee rooms in most state capitals in the U.S. have the sort of video capacity to bring people in and project them on typically on big screens, as I'm sure you all know. So that was just a big shift, the ability for legislatures to meet when not actually in the state capitals. So that's been the most, I think, the most noticeable change in the pandemic. And then the sort of involvement of constituents, and I know the previous panelists had some really interesting things to say about that. That's something I think that had really taken hold in most legislatures in the U.S. Prior to the pandemic, in terms of setting up systems for them to submit comments on legislation and to participate in polling. Some of that was being done by individual members. So it wasn't necessarily institutional, and a few states have kind of moved in that direction and set up platforms for that kind of input. I'm going to tell you, I talk to a lot of legislators, a lot of legislative leaders on a fairly frequent basis, and there's a tension there, particularly around platforms like Facebook and Twitter, because they sometimes get concerned that the people participating through Twitter and Facebook aren't necessarily a representation of maybe their constituent views on a particular issue. So they're trying to figure out not how to use the technology, that's kind of the easy part, but how to understand and analyze and put it in context when you're getting a whole set of voices on through a Facebook channel or through Twitter or one of the other social media outlets. So I think that's something that it's the technology is really pretty integrated into most legislative bodies here, and most of the members probably spend, if you were to ask legislative leaders, they would say they spend too much time on Twitter and Facebook listening to the folks there, because there's a real concern that people coming in through these channels are really not a very representative sample of people in their districts. So that's something they're kind of struggling with. But it's, listening to constituents is a vital aspect of being a policymaker, and they understand that. I think they're struggling with how to put it in context. So that's something I would submit, not necessarily a technical issue, but a big issue for legislatures. I think that the big challenges moving forward here in the states are, where they pull back to what was sort of the pre-COVID norms and procedures versus how much of this becomes institutionalized. My observation just in the last few months, so most of our legislatures come into session in January, and then some of them are very full-time and meet the entire year, about 10 states, including the big states you've maybe heard of, California and New York, but then Texas, which is I think now the second largest U.S. state, is very much still a part-time legislature. Only meets once every 2 years, but has a very active interim committee process. So it just shows there's a great diversity within the U.S. states in terms of their operations and their designs. So I guess what's happening is that some states have decided to really integrate this ability for members to participate remotely. And I have to say, it's been largely around some of the accessibility issues and disability issues. If you have members who have difficulty because of a recognized disability participating, they're using the sort of new floor access through technology and these kinds of platforms to accommodate members and to a lesser degree staff in their ability to participate. Most staff agencies now are coming back in person. It's hard to do a whole lot of telework or work from home when the legislative session is so concentrated in the little radius of the state capitol and the floor of the House and the floor of the Senate. I suspect, I don't know if this is relevant necessarily, but there'll be a whole lot of work from home for legislative staff in the interim periods when they're just doing research and preparing for upcoming sessions and starting to research bills and draft bills and that kind of thing. I think legislatures are really intent on trying to figure out the balance between public input and the technology, and also making sure that they're getting the views of a broad range of people using the many streams of information that are coming at them. Most legislators here, and it's probably true around the world, are drowning in information and people trying to get their attention. I was talking to a legislator at a very small, medium small state, and he said, with the session coming up, he's now getting into his inbox over 1,000 emails a day, and that's probably pretty typical. And some of them are constituents, and a whole bunch are not. They're organized kind of fake grassroots things to try to get their attention on one issue or another. But I think in terms of bringing voices in, especially experts, as like Brazil and many countries around the world, the United States is a big geographic place, and so the greatest experts on a particular issue might be somewhere far flung in another state, and maybe they're a doctor of some kind and can't leave their practice, but now you can bring someone from another state. In fact, our staff frequently testify in legislatures before committees, not on the floor, around all these issues I talked about at the top of my presentation: marijuana legalization and the state's shift to electric vehicles and how they're coping with that, as well as the traditional very controversial issues like abortion and of course gun laws in the United States, which vary greatly from state to state. So I think that's another element that's going to become more permanent, is having experts coming in from far-flung places within the United States, maybe even within the world, to give expert testimony in front of committees. I hope that events like this will help us continue to stay connected across the globe. Frankly, it's gotten far more convenient, but we are struggling with the balance between looking at Zoom cameras and communicating this way versus what we know is a different kind of interaction when people come together, and trying to get back to that. I can tell you, if you surveyed the 7,383 state legislators in the United States, plus the legislators in the territories, I'd venture to say it'd be 95% who would say, I am exhausted looking at Zoom calls and Zoom screens and all screens. They are craving the ability to be together in person in committee rooms and on the floor. And most of them are heading back in that direction. It's just a handful, with of course the Omicron variant really throwing making everybody think quickly as they were about to start sessions. So I'm going to just wrap up there. Hopefully I said a few things that are of interest and provocative, and I'm happy to take questions if there are any. And otherwise, I hope your conference is terrific, and I hope I get to, once I actually get into my office space here in just a few minutes, to maybe view a few of the panels throughout the rest of the day. Thank you again. Real honor to be asked to be part of the conference.